Hello. Today is Friday, September 6th, and welcome to episode 356 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Lester Munson. I'm joined today by NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Martha Miller, NSI's newest fellow and former Deputy Executive Director, Jessica Jones, and my fellow senior fellow, Jeffrey Wells. A great group for you this fun Friday. Today, we are going to talk about the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. What is that, you might ask? Well, that is a every 3 years summit between Chinese Communist Party leadership and the leadership of the 55 or so African nations. This year, it's happening in Beijing. All African countries are represented except for Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, which recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate representative of the Chinese people, not Beijing. So they are not invited to Beijing. But the other leaders of the other countries, about half have sent their head of state. This is a 3-day affair. China will be discussing diplomatic relations, investments, loans, aid programs, cooperation in various areas. Xi Jinping has already announced that China will be providing $50 billion in assistance to the African continent over the next 3 years. Notably, 60% of that or so is going to be in the form of loans, which are hugely problematic in terms of the actual economic development of developing countries, as most of the African continent is. Some other quick notes about the China-Africa relationship. China is Africa's biggest trading partner. It is the biggest provider of weapons to Africa. China's one international military base is a naval base in Djibouti. Djibouti is also a Chinese country, or is also an African country, by the way. One of the issues between African countries and China is the fact that China mostly in terms of trade, China is mostly sending manufactured goods to Africa, and Africa is providing commodities to China. African countries would like to flip that a little bit and see China buy more goods actually produced in Africa, manufactured there, which is better value for African economies. So there are some, as we might say, fault lines between Beijing and these African countries. Let me just throw out there one more quick fact before we go around the horn here. The Biden administration had a summit with African leaders in 2022. President Biden, of course, also hosted President Ruto of Kenya for a state dinner recently. But President Biden has not been to the African continent. President Trump, his predecessor, did not go to Africa. The U.S. has not been as engaged on the African continent, generally speaking, as China has been in the last decade or so. Martha, let's go to you first. I'm interested to get your reaction to this summit in Beijing. Is it significant? What are the lessons we can be learning? How should American policymakers be thinking about this?
So I think, first of all, as you noted, this is not a new occurrence. This happens every 3 years. So in some ways, this is not surprising or, news in any breaking news kind of fashion. This is, however, a reminder of the price that we pay for treating Africa like a backwater. We are playing catch up now. We have not had a focus on Africa for many years. It was really Clinton and George W. Bush who paid attention to Africa in a meaningful way. Since then, we really have not had anything but maybe one visit from Obama, a summit in the Biden administration, but nothing has really come of that. So, we can't really expect a whole lot more. Also, I think it's important to note that both, China and Russia are both treating the African continent like a strategic priority. They have it as a very high priority, and they are reverting back to language from the Cold War, including anti-colonialism, as they themselves engage in an imperialist agenda across the continent.
It's almost like that anti-colonialism thing is just a bunch of nonsense, Martha. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I concur.
Uh, Jones, what are your thoughts here? Should we be? Is this summit of great concern to the United States? Are we missing a huge opportunity here that China is exploiting?
I know we're called fault lines, so I hate to agree with Martha. We point out that it happens every 3 years over the last couple of decades. And I remember we talked about the US Africa Leaders Summit here on the show, and I could have sworn it was December 2023 because I was thinking nothing's happened. I haven't seen any, what's the implementation plan? I assumed it had just occurred. You're right, Les. It was 2022. And what have we talked about since? Coups across the continent, South Africa essentially, inviting Vladimir Putin despite his arrest warrant from the ICC. And as Martha pointed out, we had one state visit by Kenyan President Ruto, and then his country turned into protests and a clampdown. And as Morgan pointed out when we discussed that, it seems like we went in all in Kenya because that's kind of the only partner we had left on the continent. And so I think the summit is more important for the fact that it occurs every 3 years, the summit, the China-Africa Forum, that the amount of effort that China puts into building relationships, diplomatic engagement on the continent. There's just this mismatch with the amount, it's no surprise that African leaders feel like equals with Xi and their Chinese partners, where we, to Martha's point, make them feel like a backwater. And so some of the specific numbers, $50 billion in aid, you could point out 3 years ago, China promised that they buy $50 billion of goods from Africa, and that hasn't occurred. So to your point, there's probably going to be maybe, and I'll put in air quotes, hot, difficult conversations that African leaders are having while they're at their forum. But the most important part is that the forum is occurring at all.
Jeffrey, what are your thoughts here? Is China getting the jump on us in a way that we could avoid if we were paying attention?
Well, I think certainly here there's a lot of pomp and circumstance around this, which is propaganda driven, and as China has said, this is a win-win partnership, and I don't know if that's new Chinese slang for "we take you" or not, but this is a bit of a bait and switch. They're trying to portray themselves to the global South as the protectors and the champion of the global South, while the North has historically taken advantage of it. That they're coming in with their money with no strings attached, but there certainly are. And contrasting themselves, and we're bringing in, we're willing to offer you all this money, but we're not bringing our conditions related to governance, democracy, and human rights. We just want you to buy our stuff. And I think Africa is maturing and knows that there is a debt trap that's happening here, and they are I think pushing back a little bit, and they're going to have some hard conversations when they get home about what are we selling beyond our critical minerals, as everyone's highlighted earlier. They want to be able to have this kind of be a bilateral relationship where they're selling African domestic goods to China, and would like to see it as a win-win. The United States certainly here has to reassess and recalibrate its national security and geopolitical strategies for the global South as a whole, to include Africa. I think that we've not been paying attention. We've been focused on the South China Sea and Eurasia to the detriment of the global South. But I think China has just is using this as a huge marketing ploy in the P.T. Barnum way, and I think a lot of people are showing up, but I don't know that everybody's leaving feeling warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, I think as you say, Jeffrey, the African countries are kind of maturing and realizing that these relationships with global superpowers are fraught with real difficult situations. The fact that China wants to loan a bunch of money to African countries and then not provide good terms for them, ultimately, they're starting to see the real trap that in fact is. I'm less worried about Chinese engagement in Africa than I am about just the incoherent U.S. approach to the continent over the last few years. This is a zone where diplomacy can be incredibly effective. There's a cost effectiveness to outreach to Africa, where there are 55 countries. You can have a summit with a whole bunch of folks who want to be friendly to you, who are looking for a more mature economic relationship. We get all caught up in lectures on human rights and diplomatic niceties and things like that. We've screwed up our security approach across the Sahel, this administration in particular, and shame on the Biden administration for messing up the relationships there. The African people are going to suffer because of that. We should, we have a robust State Department. It is well funded. It is represented in every country. Why aren't we doing a better job of outreach to these places? It doesn't take much. The Chinese do a summit once every 3 years. We could do it once every 2 years and be way ahead of the game. We have saved an entire generation from HIV/AIDS in Africa over the last 25 years because of the PEPFAR program. We don't claim credit for that. We don't try to get credit for that. We should. We have transformed the African public health system such that when COVID happened, it was really not a huge problem on the African continent because they were able to identify challenges and opportunities. In fact, in some cases, as Debbie Birx will say, faster than the U.S. was able to. So we've done a lot of good in the African continent, and we don't seem to, but our national security institutions don't seem to be able to kind of grab a hold of that and advance the ball in a way. And it does make China look a little bit better. I'm not super worried about that aspect of it. I think I would like to see our folks in the executive branch do a better job. Congress ought to be holding their feet to the fire and demanding they come up and explain why these kinds of things aren't working out better from our perspective.
Okay. I think we need is a strategy. Let's just have a strategy.
A strategy,
yes.
Just hold a summit every 2 years.
I just want a strategy. Can we start there? Yeah, and then we can have conferences.
Any strategy, yes. Yeah. Let us discuss something. Okay, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Monday, September 9th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. Fault Lines is on YouTube. Please check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.